Okay, so then let's start with doing a few prayers. In the prayer book that you have there, we're going to begin on page 73, and we'll start with that first verse that we'll recite 3 times. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Then go forward in your prayer book to either page 97 or 98 for the short mandala offering. We'll just do that first verse there, that single verse, followed by the offering mantra in Sanskrit that's on page 98. And then right after that is refuge and bodhicitta, which we'll do once in English and twice in the Tibetan. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyapsu chi daki chunyan gi peso nam gi drola penchir sangye drupar shok. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyapsu chi daki chunyan gi peso nam gi drola penchir sangye drupar shok. Okay, let's have a short meditation before we begin tonight's class. So again, the meditation serves 2 purposes. First is to focus our minds a bit, to let go of any distractions that we might have from our day, just to allow that to settle. And then on the basis of a calmer mind, we'll spend a few moments reflecting on our motivation for being here, trying to generate the best intention to be here. So just find a good meditation posture, make sure that the back is straight, and bring your awareness to the breath. And you can work with the breath in whatever way suits your mind. If you don't have a particular technique that you use, you can tune into the sensation that occurs just inside the tip of the nose. As you breathe in and out through the nostrils, that very subtle sensation that occurs there becomes your meditation object. And just try to stay present with it as you breathe in, as you breathe out. And whenever the mind wanders, to be vigilant, kind of notice that that's happened, and let go of whatever it was that distracted you, whatever thoughts or maybe sensations Whatever it was that pulled you away from the breath, simply let it go. Return your attention back to the breath. So I'll ring the chime, and we'll do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set motivation for tonight. So now, with our minds a bit more settled, let's generate the best motivation for being here. This whole investigation of the mind that we're undertaking in this course certainly has great relevance to our own peace of mind, our own ability to create the causes for our happiness, to remove our own suffering. And there's nothing wrong with starting at that level of motivation to recognize that this work that we're doing will help us to eventually tame our minds completely, to reduce all of our negative tendencies, to uproot what is beneath all of those, the fundamental ignorance that is keeping us bound in this cycle of suffering, and to achieve a state of true peace, nirvana, where we have gotten rid of everything that disturbs the mind and can abide in that state. And this is certainly something that the Buddha taught a path to achieving. But the Buddha also taught the path to going beyond that, to not just achieving our own welfare, but to achieving the welfare of all beings, to work on our minds more completely, to develop our potential more fully, so that we can help every sentient being to do the same work. So to generate that mind, we need to have very far-reaching compassion and love for all beings, to feel our hearts open to their situation, to see that every single being is really no different than ourselves in that fundamental desire to be happy, to not suffer. And moreover, we are connected to all these beings. Our own welfare is intimately tied up with their welfare. We depend upon them greatly for both our temporal happiness as well as our ultimate happiness. So try to generate this motivation of bodhicitta, this mind that seeks to achieve the goal of Buddhahood, the fulfillment of your complete potential, so that you can then help others to do the same. To think that we're going to undertake this investigation of the mind so we can more clearly understand our own minds, but also understand how we can benefit others through that knowledge, how we can become a source of wisdom and compassion for all beings. Okay. So what we are working on currently are the 5 omnipresent mental factors. Again, this text is a study, and those of you who are new tonight, again, know that you can maybe look on someone who has the text, and if you'd like a copy of this in a electronic format, I'd be happy to send that to you. Just give me your information by the end of class. We're on page 21 of the text. We're about ready to start the third of these 5 omnipresent mental factors. So what we're looking at, in a sense, when we're examining these mental factors, is we can say that there is mind, which is the uh, kind of whole arena in which all of this is taking place. And we have 6 main minds. We have our 5 sensory consciousnesses, and we have our mental consciousness. And then we have all of these factors, these mental factors that are ways of, if we kind of conceptualize what's all going on in our minds, we can pick apart various components of it. And the ones that we've looked at so far that are part of these 5 omnipresent or ever-present mental factors are feeling, which was one that the Buddha highlighted very much, as well as discrimination. And by feeling, we don't mean the whole range of emotions that we have. We rather mean, again, a feeling tone that is there all the time. We either have a registration of a pleasant sensation, an unpleasant sensation, or a neutral sensation. The second mental factor that we looked at, discrimination, is also there all the time. Discrimination is simply that aspect of our mind that is discerning one thing from another. We have it present in a conceptual way, certainly, when we are thinking about things, but we also have it present even when our sensory consciousnesses are listening to things and or hear or seeing things or tasting things and so on, where we can discriminate various components of that whole experience. So again, this is the idea behind these first 2, and they were taught not just in the context of these mental factors, but as I mentioned previously, in the context of what are called the 5 aggregates, which are really important way that the Buddha had of examining what is the basis for a being in particular. That's the way the 5 aggregates are generally looked at, is that each of us as a being has various components that we could say make up the basis for our being. And the feeling and discrimination were set out primarily because, again, we have a registration in regard to those feelings that causes us to get caught up in a lot of pursuing after those things that are pleasant, not wanting to experience those things that are unpleasant. And then, of course, discrimination, we get into discriminating a lot of views about things in terms of the world around us, and this is good, this is bad, what have you. And some of that, again, you can have correct discrimination, but discrimination can frequently lead to conflict. So we see that these 2 in particular were set out in that context. So are there any questions on feeling and discrimination before? This is still not going, huh? Oh, I know, it's got to go down here to HDMI 1 or 2. There's no slide up here yet, by the way, anyway. I'm going to go to the slides in a moment. Now it should come up. It'll probably come up with a nice scenery. No? No, I don't think it's on VGA because I don't have it on the other thing. I've got it on the HDMI. Sorry, we're having technical problems here. There we go. Okay. So let's go ahead and continue then. If there's no questions on these first 2 factors, Let's go ahead and continue then on the bottom of page 21 with this third factor. Again, keeping in mind that all of these factors that we're looking at in this first section are there in any of our sort of more conscious times of awareness. They become very subtle when we're dealing with sleep or with various other certain states that were set out previously. But the idea is that in most of our waking moments, all of these are operative, all 5 of these. This third one, even though the first 2 are quite important, as you could tell from the time that we spent on them, this third one is even more important in many ways. Many of you recall the teachings we had with Venerable Rabina a few weekends ago, and she talked about intention a lot. Intention is a mental factor that is intimately involved in creating karma. In fact, we could say karma is intention, is that mental factor that is moving our minds in various directions. So let's take a look at this first, and then I'll put a few slides on that kind of explore this from the other texts that we've been using, Geshe Rabtin's commentary and so on, and we'll explore a little bit more about intention. So at the bottom of that page, by the way, intention in some texts will be called volition. In another text, I think it was called mental impulse. It's kind of hard to get at exactly what we mean by this. Usually when we use the word intention in English, we kind of mean more of a conceptual idea. What is your intention in doing that? What are the thoughts behind it? But as we'll see, intention is present in all of our consciousnesses. So even when we have our eye consciousness simply engaging in a particular color or shape or what have you, that's also intention. So it's not solely something that is conceptual, but rather it's something that can be conceptual and more guided, but it's also quite just sort of there, operative at all times in terms of our way of engaging in the world around us. So at the very bottom of 21, it says, regarding the entity of intention, the compendium of knowledge, again, recall that that's the text by Asanga, the higher Abhidharma, sets out the following, and this is the top of page 22 now. Question, what is intention? Response, it is a compositional mental action of the mind. It has the function of engaging the mind in virtue, non-virtue, or the unspecified. So it's calling it kind of mental action. We often talk about it as maybe being the movement of the mind towards the various objects that the mind knows, that the mind is relating to. So this whole idea of its function of engaging the mind in virtue, non-virtue, or the unspecified speaks to what I was saying earlier, that essentially intention is what creates karma. And most of you have an awareness of karma. Karma in Buddhist terms is essentially the cause, although we often use it to refer to the law of cause and effect. We have great confidence in the law of cause and effect in the natural world around us. We know that there are certain factors that lead to certain results, and we have great faith in that because we see those played out all the time. I always use the example of, if you were getting ready to plant a garden for the summer and, to have vegetables in the fall and what have you, you have to put all the causes into place for that to happen. You don't just sit there and keep looking out at your plot of land and saying, I can't wait for the vegetables in the fall. When you don't do anything, you don't plant anything, you don't put nutrients in the soil, you don't water it, you don't make sure it gets enough sunlight and the weeds are pulled and everything. Instead, nothing will happen. You won't get a vegetable garden because you haven't created the causes for it. Well, when it comes to karma, we're simply talking about cause and effect in relation to the experiences of sentient beings. Going back to that mental factor of feeling, you'll recall, if we go back to that page where feeling was talked about, feeling was said to be the ripening of our karmic actions. Back on page 15 at the bottom, what is the defining characteristic of feeling? It has the characteristic of experience. Through the entity of experience, it experiences individually the fruitional results of virtuous and non-virtuous actions. And we could say even unspecified actions. Because we have 3 feeling tones. We have the pleasant experiences that we enjoy, the unpleasant ones that we want to avoid, and then we have the neutral ones that we're just kind of happening, that we don't really have any particular registration around. Those are all the fruition of our karma. So the Buddha is saying that what we are experiencing in terms of our relation to the physical world as well as our own mental world, all of this is the ripening of our past actions. And the way in which that is generated is through this mental factor of intention. So let's look at a little bit more of what's in the text, and then I'll go to some of the slides and we'll explore this in a bit more detail. In our text, Yeshe Gyaltsen on page 22 says, just as it has been said above, the mental factor which rouses and moves the mind that is concomitant with it to an object is called intention. This is said to be the principle among all mental factors. It is taught that any mind or mental factor engages an object due to the power of this mental factor. So again, it's not something we can turn off and on. We can't turn off our intention. It's always going to be there. Our minds are always going to be moving towards some sort of object. By virtue of there being a subject, there is always an object. It's an interdependent, thing going on. It is to some degree up to us to determine what we use that intention for, because it can be more controlled than it currently is. Our minds have a tendency to gravitate towards all of those things that we're habitually going after, that we're karmically influenced to enjoy. And so we create that type of an intention that keeps grasping at things, getting more and more attached to all the pleasant, wonderful things. But then the intention also, moves us away from those unpleasant experiences and tries to keep us safe from all of those. So our mind is continually engaging in this factor of intention in ways that don't really support the development of the actual results that we're seeking. This is what we talked about way early on in the text, is that the reason to understand these mental factors is to really get the kind of workings of how we actually can achieve real happiness. If we continue to habitually go after all those pleasant experiences, we know from what we've done in the past that it doesn't lead to any real lasting happiness. Instead, it just creates more and more of a condition for wanting more rather than being satisfied. And if we keep trying to push away everything that is unpleasant, it's just impossible to ever do that, to get that completely out of our lives by simply having an aversion, developing more hatred, more anger, more irritation towards those things. Rather, we simply exacerbate our own suffering. And so this is, again, the fundamental teachings on karma that, as I said, most of you in the room have had some contact with before. So I won't talk that much about karma, but know that we will get into a little bit as we go through, this whole section on intention. The final thing that's in this paragraph before we go to some slides, it says there, for example, just as iron is helplessly drawn by a magnet, the mind helplessly engages an object due to this mental factor intention. So this is speaking to the natural way that occurs. Obviously, as I said, we can be more focused in our intention, where we actually want to put our intention, how we want it to engage in particular objects, so that we kind of bring along for the ride much more virtuous states of mind. As we'll see, the mental factor of intention doesn't have a particular flavor. It's not going to be virtuous, non-virtuous, what have you. It's rather something that is influenced by what comes along for the ride, what sorts of mindsets we bring along. Yeah, Jane. The underlying filter of everything? In a sense, but it's not, it's simply the movement of the mind towards those things. As I was saying, it doesn't have a role in creating any particular other patterns other than the pattern of that continual going back to those same objects and having. It's up to the other states of mind that we're going to talk about as we go through the rest of the mental factors to determine more the flavor of what our intention really is, because the mind's going to always be engaged in an object. I mean, an example might be, if you were to eat a delicious meal, you could do that with bringing along a whole lot of attachment, and the intention of the mind is going to be continually moving towards the taste of that food as we put forkful after forkful in our mouth. But we could also be doing that with a completely virtuous state of mind, where we're thinking about offering it, where we're thinking about the generosity of other beings having that same type of food, and so on. So it would really depend upon what other mind states are there, what other mental factors are there that flavor the intention and what it's creating. The intention, the movement, creates the karma, but the type of karma we create depends greatly upon those other factors. Uh-huh. So that Jane's question is compositional factor, because that was, well, it says here a compositional mental action. The word compositional simply means that it is created, that it is compounded from its causes and conditions. So we have to say that there is a cause, just as, I mean, all of what we call the mind is a compositional factor, in a sense, is a compositional um, phenomenon. By compositional or compounded, we mean something that arises through causes and conditions. And so, and of course, it composes or creates things that come from it. The two words, it's interesting when you study phenomenology in Buddhism, when you talk about phenomena, everything that exists, what is often called like objects of knowledge, um, you can divide that into those things that are permanent and those things that are impermanent. By permanent, we mean that they don't arise from causes and conditions. And there are a few phenomena that are like that. But the vast bulk of what we deal with in the world are compositional uh, uh, phenomena, which means impermanent phenomena, which means things that arise from causes and conditions. And in that category, there's two synonyms for impermanent phenomena or compounded phenomena. One is cause and the other is result. Because everything that is a cause is a result of what preceded it, and everything that is a cause is also a cause for the thing that will follow it, that's subsequent to it. And so in essence, we have this causal process that's going on all the time with impermanent phenomena. So anytime the word compositional or composed or compounded is used, it's simply talking about that process, that things are arising on the basis of what preceded them, those causal factors, and giving rise to something, composing something that will follow from it. Yeah, Bob. Yeah. Yeah. And we'll talk about that. There's actually a little passage that's in Geshe Tashi Sering's book, Buddhist Psychology. Bob's question was, we don't use the term free will in Buddhism, but this idea of do you really have choice in what you do? To what extent are we under the control of the causes that led us to have particular intentions, or can we actually break free of all of that? Let me share that passage after we've done a little bit more work on this, because these are all really relevant questions, right? Because we are, that's the gist of it. If we can't do anything to control these things, well, then I don't know if there's much point in studying all of it. So obviously, the answer to that, the short answer is yes, we still can, in spite of the fact that there's a great control from what we've done in the past that flavors our intentions, that flavors the tendencies that we have, the habits that we have. Nonetheless, we can break free from that. So let me share a few slides that give a little bit more of an explanation. What I've been doing in doing these is just simply to help you to um, uh, have kind of another view of what's being said by different words. In this case, sharing what I think it's Stephen Batchelor who did the translation of the book that these are taken from, which is called Mind and Its Functions. So let me go ahead and put these on. I think that we're, I got to get to slideshow. There we go. Okay. Hopefully everyone that's online here now, and hopefully everyone who's online there is seeing it. I'm getting a nod from Rachel. Hi, Rachel. Okay, so this is just saying session 6. Once more, these are the 5 that we're in the middle of, the omnipresent. Feeling, discrimination, intention. We'll go on from here to look at contact and attention. So let's go into intention based on what Geshe Rabten said, as translated by Stephen Batchelor in the book Mind and Its Functions. Intention is defined as a distinct mental factor that moves the primary mind, with which it bears the 5 similarities. Remember these 5 similarities, those of you who were here from the beginning. We looked at the fact that every mental factor that arises with a main mind has 5 similarities with it. Similarity of substance, of time, of object, and so on. I don't remember all of them exactly. Well, we can go back and take a look at those as we go through this. But the idea is that all the 5 mental factors that are there, or all of the mental factors that are there simultaneous with it, have these 5 similarities, as well as the other attendant mental factors of that primary mind to the object. So this is the idea that this intention is what moves us to engage in particular objects. It is both, and this is the important point I was talking about earlier, it is both the conscious and the automatic motivating element of consciousness that causes the mind to involve itself with and apprehend its objects. So there's both kind of an automatic component to it. I like this word automatic actually because it really is speaking to the fact that since we have that there all the time, it's just naturally, just like those, as was said in that analogy of the iron filings that naturally go to the magnet, it's just naturally being drawn to particular objects, not just completely at will, because for example, if you go into a store or something, your mind isn't going to be drawn to every single object. It's very much conditioned to have particular things that entice it, and that's part of our karmic conditioning that Bob was just speaking of. So it reiterates just what was said: just as a magnet by nature moves any iron that comes into contact with it, likewise, by the mere existence of intention, the mind is moved to various beneficial and detrimental objects. We can have a more focused intention through being more conscious of it and not letting it be simply automatic. Eventually it can be automatic even in a beneficial way. But right now our tendency is the automatic intention we have is drawing us towards detrimental objects. We're getting engaged in all those things that are maybe not so beneficial for ourselves. To continue, he says, in addition, intention is the actual principle of activity. It is karma itself. Whether an action is mental, purely in our minds, vocal or verbal, through our speaking, or physical, through our bodies, our physical actions, the formative element that is primarily responsible and that accumulates and imprints on the mind is intention. Thus, it acts as a basis for conditioned existence. So again, recall that the whole schema of what we're looking at in terms of the Buddha's teachings on why we're in the state that we're in, what we would call conditioned existence, samsara, going from life to life under the control of these various factors, our minds being propelled from one existence to the next, the most immediate cause of that is our karma. But our karma isn't arising alone. Again, everything is compositional. Everything is composed from various causes and conditions. What is driving our karma are all the various states of mind that we have. They might be beneficial, they might be detrimental, or dangerous, something that brings about more suffering. But all of that is the mechanism through which that's happening is intention. Again, we can't deny that the other factors have a role to play because, as in answer to Jane's question, the flavor of our intention is very much a product of what we have in our mind. We can have a positive intention for doing something. We can have a negative intention. And that's going to dictate what type of karma we create. But in essence, everything is created through our mental factor of intention, this kind of movement of the mind. Let's take a look at another presentation. Again, this was something I've quoted from here and there. Jeffrey Hopkins' book, Meditation on Emptiness, where he does go into each of these mental factors. He uses attention as an equivalent for this in his text, and we use attention for the fifth mental factor that's omnipresent. He uses mental engagement there, but I think intention is the more common one that's used. So anyway, intention is the mental factor that moves and directs the mind that accompanies it to its object. It has the function of engaging the mind in the virtuous, non-virtuous, and neutral. This is very similar to what we've already seen, right? Intention is the most important of all mental factors because through its power, minds and mental factors engage in objects like pieces of iron powerlessly moved by a magnet. This is a very popular analogy for what's going on here, right? Another way of talking about it is through Geshe Tashi Tsering, who's the resident teacher at our center in London, Jamyang. He is really very, I like the way that he approaches many of the topics and talking about them in a much more modern way. He says, intention is the factor that actualizes what feeling has initiated. If the feeling generated upon contact with an object is attraction, if it's something that's delightful, that's pleasant, that's registering that feeling tone, intention moves the mind toward the object. For example, I smell a ripe mango in a shop I am passing, and the feeling of attraction arises. Intention is the shift in the mental process toward buying it. It's kind of like everything that moves the mind towards the acquisition of that object, the ability to pull that object into our sphere of experience. Intention is related to motivation, he says. We often use these words a bit interchangeably. Even in Buddhism, we sometimes use them a bit interchangeably, but they are not identical. He says here, but be careful here. In Tibetan, the term motivation reflects a gross level of function, while intention is more subtle. And I would say that one of the main delineating factors is that we can have a very conceptual motivation. Usually, I mean, that usually is dictated by thoughts. That's why we spend some time at the beginning of each class generating our motivation to actually put some thought into what we want to flavor our intention with, how we want our intention to be guided, what sorts of results we want to gain from it. Whereas intention, as he says, is much more subtle. As I was mentioning, it's even present when our 5 sense consciousnesses are operative, which means that our conceptual mind isn't even engaged at that time. He used the example of like the smell of the ripe mango. Well, if you were walking down, market in the summer and you smelled something delicious like that wafting up, your smell consciousness would be drawn to it and already have an intention, even prior to your mental consciousness starting to think, oh, do I have enough money to buy that? I think I'm going to get that. That smells really good. I'm sure it's really delicious to eat. So you have kind of a conceptual process that's going to direct your intention into acquiring it, tasting it, enjoying it, maybe even wanting to go and get it again to, have an attachment to mangoes, develop an addiction to mangoes. So, and then you're also going to have just that initial moment when it's just your smell consciousness, or when you buy it and then you cut into it and you start tasting it. You've got your taste consciousness that is drawn to that object, that is having an intention towards it. But then where we really generate a lot of the karmic power behind it is what's going on in the other mental factors, when we start developing attachment, when we start developing more of these mind states that cause us to get caught up in conditioned existence again, continuing to develop that pattern. So he says here, whatever the object, intention actually moves the mind toward it. In other words, intention or volition is a karmic action. When it comes down to it, we can say that karma, when we talk about karma meaning simply the cause, the action, it is equivalent to intention. You don't create karma without intention, and it is only through the vehicle of intention that karma is created. So in essence, it is equivalent to karma. And he goes on to say karma is one of the most important words in Buddhism, but is often misunderstood. We'll look a bit at what he says about this. It refers to the law of cause and effect in relation to the mind. We may perform actions with our bodies or our speech, but it is our mental acts and our perceptions of our physical and verbal acts that create karma. New karma is created in every moment of consciousness because intention is always present. So this is maybe a little scary in some ways, but in another way, it's again speaking to the power of intention. That if we actually generate very positive thinking that motivates our intention, that informs our intention, then we can actually use it as a very powerful tool to change our experience. And that's the whole point of understanding the law of karma anyway, is because we want to have a different experience. We want to eventually be free of conditioned existence. We want to eventually achieve our greatest potential and become a Buddha. The law of karma, cause and effect, plays a role in all of those results. You don't get a result without creating the causes. You don't get the vegetable garden without planting the seeds and tending to them and so on. So this is the whole point of understanding karma, is really, really, really key, as Venerable Robina emphasized in her wonderful teachings when she was here at the beginning of the month. A little bit more from Geshe Tashi. He says, when with attraction or aversion to a sense object, our minds act, we create the potential for positive or negative experiences in the future. So intention is actually responsible for all our future pleasure and pain. And of course, it's the intention we had in the past is responsible for our present pain and pleasure. Everything that we experience is a ripening of our past actions. Everything we do with our intention now, all the actions we engage in, primarily the mental actions, though they do play out in terms of what we do with our bodies, with our speech, all of that creates what our future experiences are going to be. There's that old adage that's saying that many Tibetan masters have said, if you want to know what your past lives were like, look at your present life. If you want to know what your future lives are going to be like, look at the actions of your present life. Look at what's going on in terms of your own mind right now. We are creating our future. Every moment we are creating our future. This is the principle of karma at play. Let me talk a little bit more about this from Venerable George. This is his way of approaching it. This is one of the monks in the FPMT, a longtime student, very knowledgeable. His oral commentary is available through the FPMT. It says here, what we are singling out here is that mental factor that is the fundamental creator of karma, that is the movement of the mind. It is called intention. Intention is mental karma. It is the activity of the mind. And then again, this idea that we were just talking about, that it is not by itself virtuous or non-virtuous by nature. It becomes that by what is present. And he uses this example, he's referring to it here, he had referred to it earlier in his commentary. If you had this kind of nice surface of a table, you could do one of two things, he's saying. One would be like to drag sand across it, or maybe even use sandpaper on it. If it was a really beautiful table with a really nice finish, this would just like be awful, right? You're destroying what's there. Or you could use some really nice polish and make it even more beautiful and lustrous. And this is kind of what we're doing. The movement of the mind is what dictates whether we have this damage to our experience or whether we have something that actually complements it, makes it more beautiful, makes it more enjoyable. So he says the effect that the motion of the mind has depends on what is present in the mind. Okay. So any questions on that? Let me take off the share screen for a few minutes. We'll come back to that. There are actually a few questions here. So Rachel says, support object of, oh, she just gave me the 5 similarities. Thank you, Rachel. So is intention driven by the 3 poisons, particularly ignorance? Does Buddha have intention? Okay, so these questions, first of all, we can say that intention in and of itself is always simply going to be happening at that's why that word mental impulse as an equivalent for it is a nice way to think about it. It is just the natural automatic movement of the mind towards various objects. We're always going to have it present. But we can say certainly that it becomes flavored, certainly by the 3 poisons. It becomes driven to create the karma that will keep us bound in samsara by the 3 poisons. So it's not that it becomes any more prevalent in the mind by virtue of the 3 poisons. It simply is going to take on that non-virtuous or unwholesome aspect, especially when ignorance is present. Now, ignorance, as we're going to see when we go through all of these mental factors, ignorance is coming up. We'll get to that when we get to the 6 afflictions. When we talk about ignorance, at the most fundamental level, we're talking about a mind that actually isn't, by its very nature, non-virtuous. It is a delusion. It is a distortion of things, but we can have ignorance present even when we are engaging in virtue. I mean, we'd have to have that potential, because otherwise you wouldn't create any virtue until you had wisdom, the wisdom realizing emptiness in particular. Because the ignorance that thinks things exist intrinsically or inherently, this is the fundamental ignorance that the Buddha says is underneath our being in samsara, the root of our suffering. If we couldn't create any virtue without freeing ourselves from that ignorance, there would be no hope for us. We'd never be able to experience any type of positive things in life. So you can still be very generous, be very kind, be very compassionate while you're still together with ignorance. So ignorance certainly, when we have a mind that has ignorance present in it and it's creating intention, it's simply going to create that karma that will continue to be a cause for samsara. It may be a positive effect within samsara if it's together with virtuous states of mind, or it may be, a negative result in samsara if it's together with the non-virtuous states of mind. But nonetheless, ignorance in and of itself is not, it's not doing anything to strengthen our intention, because intention, as I said, is just always there. It's just going to flavor it to create particular results. So when we're free of the 3 poisons, her last part of her question, does a Buddha have intention? Or even we could certainly say, does someone who has freed themselves from the delusions have intention? I don't see why a Buddha wouldn't have intention, but it gets to be kind of a bit of a game to talk about a Buddha's mind. What is a Buddha's mind? A Buddha's mind is completely free of any kind of trappings, doesn't have anything that keeps it bound in any way from knowing all phenomena. This is what we say the fully developed mind has the potential to achieve, is the state of omniscience. So a Buddha can have the intention that goes out to all beings and to all objects. It's a very different intention. It's not the intention that we have, where we are generally engaging in one thing at a time, or very limited scope of movement of the mind. Whereas a Buddha's mind is continually moving out in all directions to benefit all beings. So I don't know, it's just speculation on my part, but I would think that a Buddha does have intention. It's just a very different flavor of intention than what we normally talk about. Now, does a Buddha create karma? Well, there's probably different views on that, but a Buddha certainly doesn't create any contaminated karma, because karma is a mechanism by which we experience cause and effect. A Buddha is in a state of simply experiencing the ripening of all the past karma that has led to that result. I guess I could say a Buddha is continuing to create positive karma that simply keeps a Buddha bound up in that state of that wonderful result. But a lot of teachers have said a Buddha doesn't create karma. And I don't know if that's meaning it's simply because a Buddha certainly doesn't create contaminated karma. But even on the path, they do say at some point you do create what's called uncontaminated karma, which is karma that's not together with that ignorance. So while you're on the path, you can create that type of karma. I don't know why you wouldn't be able to create that type of karma when you're a Buddha, but it becomes irrelevant at the point of being a Buddha, because a Buddha is just going to continue to abide in that state of having the intention of benefiting all beings, being motivated by doing that constantly. A Buddha doesn't have thought processes. Buddha doesn't get up in the morning and think, what should I do today with my Buddha state? Where should I go? Who should I help? A Buddha is just this energy emanating out that's benefiting all beings, informed by everything that was done on the path. So, yeah, Mary Mogenberg says, and adding to Rachel's question, the bodhisattva motivation or intention, the intention to benefit all beings, Buddha must then have intention. And again, that's, I think, part of what I was saying was that a Buddha's intention is going to be informed by everything that they did on the path. That's why we work with the mind of bodhicitta all the time, trying to strengthen that. So it becomes kind of our default intention to everything that we're doing. Yeah, Jane? Yeah, in some of that, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So Jane is bringing up the idea that motivation, as was said earlier in Geshe Tashi's commentary, is a much coarser form of mind, and intention is much subtler. Nonetheless, I mean, we can through motivation influence the intention, but intention still is very different in its own way from motivation. Yeah. It's kind of hard to get at some of these mental factors exactly what they are, but nonetheless, we can see that there is that impulse, mental impulse, that causes us to get caught up in various things, causes us to get kind of drawn to them. And then, of course, we have a whole bunch of stuff that follows from that. This is sort of setting the stage. These 5 that we're looking at is kind of setting the stage for everything else that we're going to look at, because we see that when they are operative in particular ways, they are going to influence, what's happening when we have those delightful things that bring us wonderful feelings. We're discriminating them as something that we really want to have. We're drawn towards them with this mind of intention. That all of it follows, and we just once more keep creating these same patterns over and over again. So, any questions from the room here on any of this? Let's go on then. In the text, where the next part of it on page 22, it says, when intention is divided in terms of its basis, there are 6. These look very familiar for those of you who were here for the first 2 mental factors. We had very similar divisions in terms of the supports for feeling, in terms of, that was on page 18, in terms of the support for discrimination on page 20. These are simply the way that we can talk about intention in regard to which combination of things are coming together. Remember that there are 3 main factors for a consciousness to arise of a particular object. The object itself, the consciousness that needs to be there, of course, and then this medium through which the object is known, what's called the sense power or the sense base, sense source. In Western terms, we would think of this as, for our eye consciousness, for example, being our eyeballs. That you need to have operative, good seeing eyeballs, for an object of sight, of vision, to be able to be known by our eye consciousness. We have to have an operative nose factor in our olfactory sense in order for us to smell a particular odor, and so on. Each of these have their own kind of three components that are involved. So in these six, we're simply talking about the intention that arises from contact. There's that word contact. We've seen that in each of the other previous ones. That's the next mental factor we're going to look at. Contact upon the aggregation, the coming together of a visible form, an eye sense power, and an eye consciousness. And then the next one, a sound, an ear sense power, and an ear consciousness, and so on, all the way through to the last one, which is a phenomenon, which includes anything that exists, because again, that's the sphere of knowledge that is potentially there for our mental consciousness. A mental sense power, which once more is, what's a mental sense power? Prior moment of mental, or of consciousness, prior moment of consciousness. So you could have had your eye consciousness operative, and then it feeds into your mental consciousness arising. It's what gives power to the mental consciousness arising. The mental consciousness doesn't have an organ or support for its basis. Rather, it is through the power of a previous moment of consciousness that it arises, and then the mental consciousness that's present in that moment itself. All right. Yeah, Bob. Uh-huh. Right. So, right. Um, so Bob's asking about the 12 factors of, or the 12 links of dependent origination, dependent arising. Why don't you hold on to that question, because we're going to get to contact. Contact is one of those 12, and actually even Rachel asked a question about that. I've got a few slides for that when we get to contact, because there's different views in terms of what that factor that's the sixth link in the 12 links is. Intention, where does intention fit in the 12 links? We would say it's mostly the compositional action, which is the second link. It's the composed action, which is the movement of the mind in a particular direction that can be together with a movement of the body, a movement of the speech, what have you. But right, right. Compositional action. Yeah, we would have to say that if we want to put intention into it, it's not, stated as one of the 12 links. And for those of you in the room who don't know what the 12 links are, be patient. Well, we're not going to get into it maybe in huge detail as part of this, but it's an incredibly complex teaching, the 12 links. I think it is. I think it can be very difficult to grok the whole thing. But the second mental factor, or the second of the 12 links, is this mental factor, is intention, because it's called the compositional action. Essentially, the very first link is ignorance, which is everything that creates our round of existence comes from ignorance. That's the source. Then we have an action that is together with that ignorance, that is imprinted on the consciousness, the third link, and then it gives rise to various other factors, including, again, the sixth link of contact that we will get to in the next one. But yeah, I may have to introduce the 12 links in their entirety at some point as part of this course, but it is a very complex topic. So these six are just simply one way of talking about intention. We could parse up the intention that is going to be present when these three things are coming together that are related to the eye consciousness, these three related to the ear consciousness, and so on. It's just, again, another division. This next point is really quite important. What's on page 22 there, where it says, this intention is mental action. In general, there are two types of actions. And this gets very confusing because we're using the word action as equivalent to, karma, and as equivalent to mental action in a sense, this intention. But nonetheless, we can divide our actions up into actions that are intentions, meaning that they are this mental factor alone, mental movement, and then we can also call something an intended action, which are the actions of body and speech that come from that mental intention. So, say for example, you can have a lot of mental intention frequently, but before you actually do something, say somebody's really bothering you with what they're doing, and you're generating the thought of your aversion to them, of your wanting to put them in their place, of wanting to, you know, um, in response to what they're saying, to say something hurtful towards them. You can keep creating that mental action, and that's already got some power behind it. That's a karma that we're creating. And if it stays at that level, it's simply actions that are intentions. It's simply the intention that this movement of the mind towards that annoying person or whatever that keeps creating that type of karma. But then when suddenly we've heard enough of their going on and we decide we're going to say something back to them that's really mean and cruel, we open our mouth and we use some harsh words towards them, then we've got an intended action. We've got an action of our speech that has come about through the force of that mental intention. And it doesn't have to build up. I was just using that as an example. Sometimes we almost have it instantly because we have patterns that we've gotten very acclimated to. We have karma we've done in the past that causes us to be very short-tempered, that causes us to respond to things in really quick ways. Yeah, Alex. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we would have to say it's still an intended action. Alex was using the example for those of us who do have the tendency to react really quickly and even just to have the thought afterwards if you didn't really intend it to be so harsh, didn't intend to say something so negative. But we would still say that there has to be that intention because the intention caused one to move in that particular direction of saying those words. It wasn't conscious. It was probably more automatic, remembering again that at two different levels that intention is happening at. And it happens, again, really quite instantly, but nonetheless, we would still say there is intention behind it. Because don't think of, this is again conflating motivation and intention to some degree. We can influence our intention through conscious thought processes to guide it in particular ways, but a lot of it is happening at a very automatic level, very almost instinctual level, if you will. Where if we talk about instinct being karmic patterning that we've built up over time that causes us to behave in particular ways. So we don't go into any real deep process of trying to discern what it is that we're going to say unless we have the wherewithal to do that. Frequently we're just reacting. We're being very reactive to the world around us. Yeah, Jane. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Right. Uh-huh. Uh. So Jane's question is if she's walking through the market thinking about an annoying coworker getting very irritated, but then suddenly the smell of the mango, not a, oh. Your feet have taken you there. Okay, so she says that the smell of the mango she wasn't aware of, but her feet have taken her into the store to get the mango. Oh, geez. This is kind of a tough question because, again, I think we have things working at a very subtle level. Yeah, I think we do have things at a very subtle level that draw us in or pull us in particular directions. What were you going to say to that, Bob? Hmm. Sure. Right. All right. 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 It. Yeah. Bob's pointing out what's in the next bit. Let's go through that next bit because it does explain essentially what is there. I mean, we have to still say that it is an intended action because there is the movement of the body towards something. But what's all going on there? I mean, I don't know that I can pick it all apart because once more, going back to this idea that I've introduced some time ago that we, in Buddhist terms, they talk about 1/65th of a finger snap being a mental instant. And so in any particular one of, I mean, we can't even imagine what's happening at a finger snap, much less 1/65th of a finger snap. Don't ask me why it's 65th. But if you divide that into like these really small, minute moments of time that are each individual moments of intention, units of mind, if you will, well, then there's so much going on that we might not be quite aware of that is going to be some mental movement that's going to induce some physical movement or verbal movement. So let's take a look at what's said there. This is actually a quote from Vasubandhu's text, the other text besides the Sanghas that we're using as a source for a lot of what we're studying in this course. It is just as it has been said in the Treasury of Knowledge, chapter 4, stanza 1, CD. They are intention and that produced by it. Intention is mental action. That produced by it are actions of body and speech. Okay? So intended actions, as it says there, are of two types, physical actions and verbal actions. So mental action is not included in there. Mental action is intention. It is the first of these. So let me put a few slides up here. Let me go back to sharing the screen for a bit, because I do have a few slides. Is that up now? I don't know if I can. There, I have to hit the other button. I'm still getting used to Zoom. I like Zoom all in all, but okay. So this was Venerable George's. Let's go on to what Jeffrey Hopkins says about this idea. Intention is mental action, and in his book he has both the Sanskrit and the Wylie of the Tibetan. So manas karma and yiki le. Le is the word for action or karma in Tibetan. Yiki le, yi is mind, action of the mind. From among the two types of action, karma, le, again in Tibetan, actions of intention and intended actions. So if we say we're going to divide everything that is action into that which is purely mental intention, meaning mental action, purely the movement of the mind, or the physical and verbal acts that arise on the basis of that intention, that are intended in that way. This is where this word intended gets to be confusing in English, because it almost means like, again, that there's some conscious agreement to going in that particular direction. But instead, it's just the fact that the intention arises on the mental level, and then the mind or the body and the speech follow. You say something immediately before you even really think about it, or you're in there getting ready to buy the mango before you've even realized the effect that it's had upon you and the whole process that's behind that or underneath that. So these are the two types of actions of intention, which are purely mental actions, and intended actions, physical and verbal actions. Now know that both create karma, but we can't say that you can create physical and verbal karma without the mind being involved. I mean, there is some level of action. Say you're intending to walk across the field to get to where you're going. Well, you're going to be stepping on insects in the summer doing that, right? Inevitably, they're going to be ants and little creatures and what have you. Your intention is not to kill those actions or those ants. Your action of moving through the grass is happening, but because you don't have the intention directed towards those ants and towards the killing of them, you don't create the physical action of killing them. So you are purely working with the mental karma, and maybe you're, as Jane's example, as you're walking across the field, you're thinking about an annoying employee, or you're thinking about the delicious mangoes that are over in the market on the other side. You could be doing all kinds of other non-virtuous things. But you are not creating the karma of killing those ants in the strictest sense, because your intention is not engaged in that. Now, if you intentionally try to find the ant hills and step on the ants as you go across, then that's a whole other story, right? So we can see that the mental action is the great dictator of it, and it can purely be at the mental action level. But we generally don't find our mouths speaking without our minds being somewhat involved. It's preconditioned, but as Jane's saying, but nonetheless, it's still going to be happening through some sort of mental process, the mental awareness moving into that sphere of verbal or physical actions. So that's how we mean intended here. We don't mean intended in terms of I really meant to do that. It's really more I have an active component of my mind that is causing me to go in that direction, that is causing me to do that physical action or that verbal action. All right? Let me look at, there's one more slide that kind of summarizes this. This is from Emily Sue, my classmate at the master's program. She did a whole presentation when she taught on these, and I just took that straight from hers, which is really just a way of summarizing these two types of actions. Actions that are intentions, or karma that is purely intention, that is mental karma, mental actions, which is the mental factor of intention itself. That's what we're talking about here. And so you're creating that in a sense all the time, but nonetheless, we can still talk about actions in the sense of them being physical and verbal, which are our intended actions, that are actions produced by the mental factor of intention. The mental factor of intention causes us to, move in that direction of engaging in another way, physically or verbally with the object, not just mentally. So, any questions on that? Let me stop the share screen again. Okay, I don't think I'm getting any questions from on screen, so let's go ahead and continue. On the top of page 23, it says, furthermore, although they are infinite, I mean, the number of actions we can imagine are infinite, verbal, physical, mental, it is taught that condensing the principal ones gives the 7 physical and verbal actions. By 7 physical and verbal, we mean 3 that are physical, 4 that are verbal. And taking into account their motivations as well, the 10 paths of action. So we can have 3 mental states, in essence, that are behind these. So these are the common ones that we know in this tradition as being called the 10 non-virtuous paths of action, the 10 non-virtuous ways that we engage in things. The 3 that are physical, the 3 of body, are killing, which is said to be the worst karma to engage in, to actually have that intention to take the life of a being and play it out in terms of them actually losing their life on the basis of our physical action. Stealing, where we take what is not offered to us with a mind of wanting to possess it for ourselves, to take it away from the person who owns it, the people that own it, whoever owns it. And we complete that by bringing that into our sphere of possession. The third one, which is unwise sexual behavior, which is primarily referring to adulterous or any sort of non-consensual sexual behavior where we are abusing our sexuality in that way by having sex outside of a committed relationship, or with someone who's in a committed relationship where we knowingly do that, or where we are engaging in sexuality that is where there's no consent from the party that we're engaging. This would include things like rape and other behavior like that. The usual one that's talked about is adultery. Even in the traditional text, it doesn't talk much about rape, but we'd have to say that that's included in this category when someone's abusing someone through sexuality in that way. And there are other ways that we can be unwise with our sexuality, but those are the principal ones. So those are the 3 that are physical. And again, we have to have an intention to engage in them in that way, to do those particular actions. There's a mental component that is always involved in these. The 4 of speech are lying, when we use our speech to deceive others. And we do that in a variety of ways. By the way, when we talk about speech, though there is the vibrating of the vocal cords and all of that involved in some of our speech, now we communicate in so many different ways, right? So texting, emailing, even body language, all of these can be an extension of our speech. And so any way that we physically put something out there that somebody is deceived by, and we intend to deceive them, maybe they don't even have to be deceived by it. Maybe they know that we're a liar, and so they don't believe anything we say. But nonetheless, we have an intention to deceive them, and so we keep putting that deceit out there. They hear it and are, the recipients of that, and we keep deceiving them. The second way that we might harm others with our speech or engage in these negative behaviors of speech is dividing others with our speech, saying things that cause 2 or more parties that are currently in harmony to be divided, or who are already divided to have further division. And it doesn't mean that that has to follow from it. It just means that our speech has to have that intention to divide people. Where we tell somebody that we really like that we don't like the person that they're dating, because we don't want them to have that person in their life because we don't like them. but they may actually find that person to be somebody they really enjoy being with. So why are we dividing them through our speech and so on? These are the kinds of patterns that are through that intention to divide others. The third one of speech is where we use our speech to kind of put others down, to say things very harsh and critical. We would generally call this harsh speech. Um, Again, it's where you have that intention. You might say something that sounds really abrasive and loud because you want somebody to wake up and realize that they're out in the middle of the road and a car's coming or something. That's very different, right? If we want to harm others with our speech, or we actually want to say something that's cutting, that harms them in that way. Then the fourth one is the one that is the weakest of the four, but it's something we engage in frequently, which is meaningless talk, or they sometimes call idle chatter, where we just get really attached to talking and talking and talking and talking about whatever, politics, sports, whatever. All right, so those are the four, that covers the seven that are there. It says here, if we were to condense the physical and verbal actions, we can say that those are the main seven. Now, obviously, there are infinite, as he says. You could certainly include in this actions where we simply harm another being physically. That's not killing them, that's not stealing from them, but that is in the nature of the same types of things where we are, doing that type of, having that intention to do that type of misbehavior. And then it says, taking into account their motivations as well. The motivations are the three mental movements, which can be condensed into three strong ways that we have: attachment, aversion or anger, and ignorance. So the way that we talk about those three in the listing of the 10 is the one that's related to attachment is called covetousness. We don't use that word so much in our English language nowadays. I mean, I remember it when I grew up with the 10 Commandments, right? Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods and thy neighbor's wife. They never say anything about their husband, though. Right? So, you know, loophole, or their dog, or whoever. I mean, anyway, um, so this covetousness is when we actually are looking at what someone else owns, and they include in this even what someone owns who's selling those things. If it's in a store, if it's online, whatever, and you're actually developing a strong mind of attachment that wants to acquire things, that wants those things. I mean, obviously, we need some things in our life. We need to have food and clothing and all these, various basic necessities. But nonetheless, this is a mind that feeds that type of energy of attachment. And it might cause us to steal or to lie to somebody or to do whatever so that we can get those things. But it doesn't have to. It just culminates when we have that desire to acquire those things. The second one, the mind of ill will or malicious intent, is related to the anger, the hatred component, where we actually stew in our own minds about what somebody's done to us, and we come to the conclusion that we want to harm them. Even if we don't go about doing it, it becomes kind of complete when we have that mental movement that determines that we're going to do something to retaliate or to put that person in their place or what have you. The third one is what's called wrong view. And by wrong view, we don't mean simply just being ignorant of things, which most people on the planet are ignorant of the law of karma, for example. So we're not just talking about just that level of ignorance. We're talking about adhering to a wrong way of looking at things. So if someone has a strong conviction that karma is absolute garbage, and there's no such thing as karma, well, then they are creating a very strong wrong view that is purely a mental action. But what will ensue from that, if they are holding to that denial of karma, is the possibility of engaging in many negative actions, because they'll think there are no consequences to my actions. There's only consequences if I get caught, if I get caught killing that person or stealing from that person or whatever the case might be. So again, this is the way that these are set out traditionally. I didn't want to go into huge detail on that. And there are more topics on karma that are coming up later on this page that I would encourage those of you who want to know more about karma to examine them through primarily Lama Tsongkhapa's middle-length Lamrim with Geshe Cherub when he returns. I don't know if he'll get into karma or not. He may get into karma this summer. We'll see. But Lama Tsongkhapa's great treatise on the stages of the path, which is in the published version, it's volume 1, and then volume 2 of Geshe Sopa's commentary, which I'm going to be quoting as well, in regard to some of this So there's a stanza then here from the Treasury of Knowledge, the same chapter, chapter 4, which is all on karma. It says here, through condensing the most obvious among them, the paths of actions, the virtuous and non-virtuous in kind, we're taught to be 10. So those are the 10 that we just went through. Furthermore, when actions are divided, there are 3. We could say that any action, whether it be a mental action, physical action, verbal action, is going to be either virtuous, non-virtuous, or unspecified. By unspecified, we mean that there's no real strength of a mind in either direction to cause it to register in that regard. And I would say a lot of our day, we probably have a lot of unspecified stuff going on. When you're driving your car or something, and maybe, again, unless you're thinking about that employee or that person that, that annoying coworker, So a lot of the times we are creating a lot of this sort of neutral karma. Well, neutral karma isn't really talked about so much because it only ripens into more of the same, of just kind of neutral experiences. We get really caught up in the other two, right? Creating the really delicious, pleasant, wonderful things that we go chasing after and create negative karma in regard to that, or the non-virtuous or the unpleasant stuff that we get that reaction to. But we can still have virtuous reactions to these various things. We tend to fall into non-virtuous frequently because that's the patterns we've created, the patterns of having a mind of attachment, a mind of anger, and so on. But obviously we can create virtuous states of mind, even in this conditioned existence that we have. By virtuous, we're going to be talking about the 11 virtuous mental factors, and so you will get a chance to explore what informs those. By non-virtuous, again, we're meaning those mental factors that are delusions that are by their nature non-virtuous. So there are some delusions, one I mentioned earlier tonight, right? Ignorance. It is a delusion, but it is not by its nature non-virtuous. And these get to be hard words to pick apart, but it's a delusion, an affliction, an incorrect state of mind, but nonetheless, it's not by its nature non-virtuous, because otherwise, most of our lives we would be creating non-virtue. Even when we're being generous or kind, we'd be creating non-virtue, because we frequently have ignorance present. We haven't done anything to address that ignorance. So this will become clearer as we go through the text. But just know that these are 3 states of mind that we can be creating, or 3 actions that we have that start again with our mental intention and then play out frequently in terms of our physical or verbal actions. Then there's another categorization here. Actions are also of 3 types. We can sometimes talk about them as being meritorious, non-meritorious, or immovable. Now this is a different categorization in that, from my observation, I don't think this is encompassing of all actions, because neutral isn't included here. The unspecified, as it says, or unspecified, meaning it's not going to give rise to particularly a positive result or a negative result. It's more neutral. Immovable has a slightly different meaning, and I've talked about immovable karma before, but let me put on a slide here so that we can explore this together. This next slide is from Geshe Thupten Lodin, who was in Australia. He lived in Australia. He was a Tibetan Lama who passed away a few years back. Was involved with the FPMT to some degree, but then I think he formed his own centers in Australia. He quotes the Treasury of Knowledge by Vasubandhu again, which says, there are 3 types of karma: meritorious, demeritorious, and immovable. Immovable is a designation given to virtuous karma that ripens in the form and formless realm. So meritorious is that which takes us into more positive states and positive experiences. Demeritorious is what takes us into the unfavorable states of existence, such as being born as an animal or a hell being, a hungry ghost. And then immovable is what drives you to go outside of the desire realm into the form and the formless realm, which again, I talked about these when we were going through the exploration of the 4 form realm concentrations, the 1st through 4th concentrations, and then the 4 formless absorptions. There's a lot of terminology, but let's go to the next slide and it'll explain this a little bit more. For humans and Devas, this is how he explains what we mean by immovable, why he says that these are called immovable. And there's different ways that this is explained. I'll share the other one after this one. But for humans and Devas of the desire realm, experience switches back and forth from pleasant to suffering feelings. Is that everyone's experience in the room? You know, we don't have it like kind of set in one particular way. Thankfully, we don't have it in suffering all the time. Maybe some beings in the human realm actually do have suffering feelings almost all the time, but and maybe some have mostly pleasant. But nonetheless, we see that there's this ability for things to shift, to move, depending on the ripening of meritorious or demeritorious karma. So what gives rise to an unpleasant result is our demeritorious karma. What gives rise to a pleasant result is our meritorious karma. But in the two upper realms, what's called the form realm and the formless realm, form realm is a subtler way of existing where they don't have coarse form like the way that we have coarse form, but nonetheless they are embodied in a way. And then in the formless realm, there's not even a real gross embodiment or coarse embodiment of beings. It's simply a mental realm. But in those two upper realms, the karma does not move in this way. Your experience doesn't change in that way. He continues saying, these devas, we often call them devas, gods, gods of the form realm, gods of the formless realm, experience purely the ripening of meritorious karma. And from the time they are born until they die, they have no unpleasant or unhappy experiences. I mentioned this as well when we talked about it, that that was when we were looking at the divisions of feelings. We could say feelings, that had to do with adherence, and those that have to do with deliverance, paraphrasing it. But essentially, when you get into some of these higher realms of experience, the form and formless realm, you don't have any suffering or unpleasant feelings. It doesn't mean that you've transcended all suffering the way the Buddha taught suffering, but you don't experience the ripening of any of that type of demeritorious karma. It doesn't ripen in that state of existence. So he says their lifetime is very long, with a subtle level of consciousness experiencing only a peaceful state, I should say state of mental tranquility. Okay. So and that's one way that immovable is talked about, that their minds aren't moving in that way. Their minds go into the form realm when they're reborn there after in human existence generally. They would be born in that form realm in that particular level, and they continue to experience a sort of evenness of mind throughout that. They don't have this fluctuation from waking up on the wrong side of the bed to, whatever, waking up on the right side of the bed. So let's go on to another explanation of immovable. This was from my teacher, Geshe Jampa Gyatso's oral commentary when he taught us on Vasubandhu's Treasury of Knowledge, the Abhidharma Kosha. He says, in other words, immovable actions are those produced through cultivating the meditative stabilizations of the form and formless realms. Having created actions to be reborn in the form realm, one will definitely be born there. And I inserted here at that level and not another, because this is what he goes on to explain. So one way that immovable is talked about is what we just looked at, where there's no movement in that experience. But there's also the idea that one cannot move that karma to another type of result. So let's do the example again of the four form realm concentrations. As I mentioned previously, you develop a very high level of concentration, meditative stabilization that we call calm abiding. And the instructions are set out in all of the stages of the path texts about how you do that. Then you separate from your desire and attachment to the desire realm, and you create a mind that wants to achieve the peace that is there in the first concentration of the form realm. Then you might go on to see the first concentration as being somewhat coarse and not as peaceful as the second concentration, because these concentrations are about refining the mind even more, making the mind more peaceful, more tranquil. And so then you develop a second concentration, and then you might look at that as unfavorable and go to the third concentration as more peaceful. And there are techniques for developing all of these, which I'm not going to be expounding upon. And then you might go on to the fourth concentration. Well, this immovable idea is the idea that when you create the karma for any one of these four concentrations, it can only cause a resultant rebirth in that respective realm. The form realm has four levels for each of the four concentrations. So if you generate the first concentration alone, you've created immovable karma for a rebirth in the first concentration form realm, where you will have a physical embodiment that is the product of that immovable karma that you've created. And the same for the second, the same for the third and the fourth. They don't create other results. They only create that ripening into a rebirth in that particular realm. And that's the only way you get into those realms, in essence. They do say there are some pockets of like the fourth concentration where various pure lands and things exist, but in general we can say that those four form realm levels are completely a product of the movable karma that you create by generating a mind that is in line with those. Because when you're reborn in the first concentration form realm, you have a mind that is similar to the first concentration that you developed. And it continues in perpetuity through that existence, not wavering, and then you eventually leave that existence because you haven't transcended anything. You've really just created this immovable karma, and you fall to whatever or go to whatever existence your karma dictates that you go to next. So this is another way that immovable is talked about. Let me share the next screen from my teacher. It says here, for example, one who has created the actions to be reborn in the first concentration will definitely be born there and will not be born in the second concentration form realm. Similarly, one who has created the actions to be reborn in the second concentration will only be born there. So it's immovable in that way. It's not going to change. They actually do say that. I mean, for example, if you created a virtuous action in the desire realm by saving the life of a being, for example, the opposite of the 10 non-virtues, such as not killing or protecting life, not stealing or protecting goods, and so on. These are positive actions. So if you actually save the life of a being, you've created a very powerful karma that could cause rebirth in the human realm, could cause rebirth in the God realm, and the demigod realm. It could ripen into a variety of things. And it's movable in that way. It can be changed by other factors. Whereas the karma you create that's immovable from developing the first concentration is only going to give rise to a rebirth in the first concentration in terms of its karmic result. Does that make sense? So that's another way of thinking about immovable. Let me conclude this section and then we'll see. It's already 8:13. Okay. Maybe this is where we'll stop, because this next little section this is maybe more homework for everybody to do, is in regard to this, it's very important to know in detail all these various things, all these bullet points, every one of which is discussed in Lama Tsongkhapa's text that I mentioned, the Great Treatise on the Stages of the Path. These are all the various topics of karma that are generally discussed in the Lamrim and the Stages of the Path. And I'm not going to go through all of these because then it becomes a whole nother course on karma as opposed to a course on the mental factors. So maybe when we start off next time, I'll just go through these very briefly and delineate a few points on them, but not go into great length about them. And then, because it says even at the bottom of that, right, fearing wordiness, I shall not elaborate on them here. So I have to follow Yeshe Gelsen's advice too. He was the writer of this text. So just know that this is going to be kind of the conclusion to intention when we resume next week, and we'll go over a little bit more on karma. Let me stop the sharing and see if there's any further questions. Justin from the group up in Denver, Lama Yeshe House, says, can Vajrasattva or purification practices change or remove immovable karma? I've never heard, again, purification, immovable karma is actually a virtuous state of mind. So it's not going to be something that we have to apply an opponent power to diminish, because it's not non-virtuous, it's not demeritorious. But nonetheless, can other things change or remove immovable karma? I would have to default to simply the general understanding that we have, which is that our virtuous karma, which is both what we do in the desire realm, as well as any karma that we create in the form or the formless realm that is virtuous in nature, by default, those would be virtuous states of mind. Any of that can be weakened by strong moments of anger, wrong view, those sorts of negative mind states is what they say. So I'd have never heard a definitive answer to that, Justin, but I would say that probably it would be similar to what I've heard in regard to other virtuous karma, that it can be weakened or potentially even destroyed. Now, if your question is getting at, well, why would we want to take rebirth there? Well, this is true. A bodhisattva is going to do those actions of developing these concentrations, the four concentrations, and maybe even the four formless absorptions, with a motivation that doesn't want to take rebirth there, because it's not a place where we can generally help other beings. It's just a place where we can have that karma ripen and experience the sort of bliss that comes with that meditative state. And so it might not be something that we would do with that intention. So we probably would be continuing to hold much stronger wish to continue to be a benefit to others, continue to take rebirth in the human realm and in other realms where we can benefit others. Yeah, Bob. Uh-huh. Right. Right. Yeah. Right, right. Yeah, Bob's pointing out what we've discussed in that, we can say that there's the causes, which are the karmic seeds that we've created, but there's also the conditions that need to be there for it to ripen into its result. And for example, at the end of a bodhisattva's life, they would be creating such a strong intention to return to the human realm, for example, to continue their work to benefit beings of this realm, that even though they've created that immovable karma, it doesn't ripen into rebirth in one of the concentration realms. Yeah, Jane. No, no. Jane's question is, don't you gain access to the form realm only after the afflictions are purified? What you've done in developing the concentrations that give rebirth in the form realm is we often use this word suppressed or made non-manifest the delusions. So while you are in those states, and certainly while you are in the form realm, that are resultants of that, you don't have the arisal of these negative states of mind, but they haven't been removed. So that's why, again, when I taught about this previously, these four concentrations, the four formless absorptions, these are all part of Hindu cosmology as well, in terms of Hindu techniques that were adopted by the Buddha and by Buddhism, that are practiced by Hinduists. Again, I can't speak for all Hindus because I don't know what their individual practice is, but the way it's presented in this tradition is that in the Hindu tradition, they developed these very deep states of mind, thinking that in and of themselves they were liberation or moksha, but they don't have the potential to do that in and of themselves because they're purely a mundane path. In Buddhism, we divide things into mundane and supramundane concentrations. Mundane would mean something that is simply going to perpetuate worldly existence. It doesn't break free of that. It might be subtler and more peaceful states within cyclic existence, within samsara, but it's not free of all of that. Whereas supramundane is above our mundane, going beyond our mundane. And that would be where we actually do the work of realizing emptiness, realizing selflessness in a direct way that causes a complete cessation of the levels of the delusion that eventually get completely removed so that we have nirvana, and eventually remove even the subtler obscurations so that we attain Buddhahood. And that would be an irreversible process that would happen. So in answer to your question, you can take rebirth in a form realm and you can generate the form concentrations without them being something that gets rid of the delusions at the root, because you're simply suppressing them. You're not allowing them to manifest because you're developing a subtler state of mind where none of the objects that would induce that would be manifesting. None of the habitual patterns would be manifesting due to the strength of your concentration. So I think that may be all for tonight, unless there's any other questions here in the room, or I didn't see anyone write any additional ones on the chat board here. Okay, so again, just to remind everyone that these videos will be posted within a day or two out at my YouTube page, which I just started for this course. So if you want to have access to those, again, let me know and I'll be happy to provide you to the link for that. And if you want copies of the slides, be sure to email me. Again, get my email address after the class and everything, and I'll be happy to send you a PDF of the slides that we looked at tonight in particular, or any of the previous classes. So So let's conclude tonight with a few prayers. The prayer book that we have here, we're going to go to page 235. These are the 2 prayers that we usually end all of our classes with. Again, keeping in mind that this is part of intention as well. We're directing our minds in a very conscious way with these sorts of thoughts, trying to hold the awareness that everything we've done here tonight with that positive motivation of bodhicitta that we had has planted seeds that we now want to make sure ripen into this result of Buddhahood for ourselves as well as for all beings. And then that second verse where we recall bodhicitta and make that strong thought of bodhicitta increasing in our own hearts as well as in the hearts of all beings. So let's recite those 2 verses. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Then go forward to page 244. We're going to do the brief long life prayers for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, for Lama Zopa Rinpoche. And as we do this, we can think about all the other teachers that we and others have a karmic connection with that are benefiting us and others in the world, and create this strong intention that all these beings have good health, have long lives, and that we and others will never be parted from perfect spiritual guides in all our lives. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplished magnificent prayers, honoring the 3 jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then finally, we conclude, as usual, with just sending out this positive energy, in a sense, to all of those that we're holding in our hearts right now. We can think about our dear center member, John Craig, who passed away last Thursday, sending that energy to him, his consciousness, wherever it is in the process, to be able to find perfect conditions in his next rebirth to meet and practice the Dharma, become enlightened quickly. All the others that are involved with this center who are undergoing difficulties, obstacles, hardships, illness, and so on, as well as anyone else that we're holding in our hearts right now who's undergoing suffering, dedicate very strongly for these beings so that what we've done here tonight becomes a cause for their happiness, for their well-being. And then also dedicate that all beings attain true peace and happiness through all of our efforts here tonight. Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you everyone who's been participating online, and see you next week.
Thank you, Don.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thanks again, Don.
Okay, good to see you too. Bye.